In Wisconsin today, Jeffrey Dahmer died. He was murdered in the prison where he was sent in 1991 for murdering 17 men and boys.
November 28, 1994, one of the most notorious serial killers in history met his end. Jeffrey Dahmer, who had killed and cannibalized 17 men, was bludgeoned to death by a fellow inmate in a Wisconsin prison. Here's some serial killers who got taken out in prison. Donald Harvey.
Cincinnati's so-called angel of death, Donald Harvey, dies this morning after a brutal beating in prison.
1987. Donald Harvey pled guilty to killing 37 people. The soft-looking man had been hiding a decades-long secret. While working as an orderly, Harvey was poisoning hospital patients driven by some god complex. He saw himself as an angel of death who decided to end the suffering of the terminally ill. April 15, 1952. Harvey was born to a poor family near Cincinnati, Ohio. He dropped out of school after 9th grade but earned his GED through correspondence school. Still, he remained unemployed and aimless until he went to care for his dying grandfather in a hospital in Kentucky. There, he developed a morbid fascination with death. He became a frequent visitor to the hospital and was eventually hired as an orderly. He gave his patients medications and saw to both their medical and personal needs. He became obsessed with this feeling of power over the helpless as he controlled all the routines that would keep him alive. May 30th, 1970, Harvey smothered 88-year-old Logan Evans with a pillow and a plastic bag in a fit of rage after Evans rubbed feces in his face. This marked the start of Harvey's brutal killing spree. Now, the majority of his targets were elderly and terminally ill patients, and his deeds remained undetected for many years. With no one suspecting him, he felt invincible. Consequently, he used whatever means he had at hand to murder them. Harvey's preferred way of killing his victims was by poisoning them. He would put chemicals like cyanide, rat poison, and arsenic into his victims' foods and drinks. He would also suffocate his victims, either with pillows or by letting their oxygen tanks run out. Now, he would continue this rampage for nearly 2 decades until a stroke of luck during an autopsy finally unveiled his sinister acts. March 1987, a man named John Powell was hospitalized after a motorcycle accident. He unfortunately died in his hospital bed, but not from his injuries. During a routine autopsy, a doctor noticed an unexpected scent emanating from his stomach: cyanide. It was clear that Powell had been poisoned. Harvey was the attending nurse at the time, and the investigation quickly zeroed in on him. He was brought in for questioning, where he eventually confessed to killing Powell. He said he did it out of pity for Powell and his family. Now, he didn't mention the other murders he had committed, but the evidence soon revealed that he was responsible for dozens of other deaths in 2 different hospitals, one in Kentucky and one in Ohio. The authorities had enough proof to convict Harvey of killing 37 people, but some estimates suggest he may have killed over 100.
Donald Harvey killed, in and out of hospitals, as many as 130 people.
Later in an interview, Harvey claimed that he was mostly motivated by mercy. "I felt what I was doing was right. I was putting people out of their misery. I hope if I'm ever sick and full of tubes or on a respirator, someone would come and end it." August 18, 1987, Donald was sentenced to 4 consecutive life terms in Ohio. A month later, he would receive 3 more life sentences and 3 20-year terms in Kentucky. March 30, 2017, Harvey died at the age of 64 in the Toledo Correctional Institution, Ohio. And just like his victims, he didn't die of natural causes. This man was found in his cell, severely beaten and bleeding from the head. He was rushed to a hospital where he was pronounced dead. The autopsy showed that he had suffered multiple skull fractures and brain injuries. Now, the killer was identified as James Elliott, an inmate who was serving a life sentence for aggravated murder. He was serving time with Harvey in the protective custody unit, where inmates who are at risk of being attacked by other prisoners are housed. Now, Elliott used a metal bar from a closet to bludgeon Harvey to death while the guards were doing their rounds. He later told authorities that he had planned the murder for weeks after learning about Harvey's crimes. He revealed that he grew up in Kentucky, near some of Harvey's victims' relatives. He said he was disgusted by Harvey's actions and couldn't stand seeing him alive and breathing. Albert DeSalvo. July 8, 1962. Readers of the Sunday edition of the Boston Herald opened their pages to a shocking headline: Mad Strangler kills 4 women in Boston. For the next 2 years, a ruthless serial killer would stalk and murder 13 women, leaving behind a trail of terror and mystery. The killing spree only came to an end with the imprisonment of Albert Henry DeSalvo, who confessed to being the infamous Boston Strangler. September 3, 1931. DeSalvo was born in Chelsea, Massachusetts. He had a traumatic childhood marked by the abuse of his father, a violent alcoholic who constantly abused his wife in front of their children. He also exposed his family to his sexual escapades with prostitutes, whom he brought home and forced his wife and kids to watch. Growing up around so much violence and depravity, DeSalvo soon developed his own twisted tendencies. He would torture animals as a kid and become a petty thief and delinquent as a teen, often getting into trouble with the law. In March 1960, DeSalvo admitted to being the measuring man after he was arrested for breaking into a woman's house. Now, this was the moniker given for a serial predator who went door to door, disguised as a modeling scout. Once admitted into his victims' homes, he would use measuring tape as an excuse to molest the unsuspecting women. This man was given 18 months in jail, but was released after 11 for good behavior. Oddly, around the time DeSalvo got out of prison, 13 single women between the ages of 19 and 85 were murdered in the Boston area. They were eventually tied to the Boston Strangler. Most of these women were sexually assaulted in their apartments and then strangled with articles of their clothing. At the same time, the police were looking for a criminal dubbed the Green Man because of the color he wore when he committed his sexual assaults. The Green Man was also none other than Albert DeSalvo. October 27, 1964. He was finally caught when one of his victims reported him to the police and gave a detailed description of him. Authorities believe that during his rampage he committed more than 400 burglaries and sexually assaulted more than 300 women. 1967. DeSalvo was convicted and sentenced to life in prison for his Green Man crime and was sent to Bridgewater State Hospital for evaluation, where he shocked everyone by boldly confessing his identity as the notorious Boston Strangler. However, he was never formally charged with any of the murders, mainly because there was no physical evidence linking him to the scenes, and also because the few women who had survived the Strangler's attacks failed to recognize him. February 1967. DeSalvo made a daring escape from Bridgewater State Hospital along with 2 other inmates: murderer Frederick E. Erickson and armed robber George W. Harrison. This would set off a huge manhunt, which led to the capture of Erickson and Harrison on the same day. But DeSalvo, he seemed to disappear into thin air, leaving the city of Boston on edge. A note was discovered on DeSalvo's bunk, addressed to the hospital superintendent. In the note, DeSalvo explained that he had escaped to draw attention to the hospital's conditions and his own situation. 3 days later, DeSalvo contacted his lawyer and decided to turn himself in. The lawyer then alerted the police, who rearrested DeSalvo in Lynn, Massachusetts. Now, following the escape, DeSalvo was transferred to Walpole, a max security prison, where he reiterated his confession to being the Boston Strangler to another inmate. As a lifer, DeSalvo believed he had nothing to lose and started dealing drugs inside the prison, but he thought wrong. November 25, 1973. DeSalvo met his demise in a frenzy of violence, discovered brutally stabbed to death in the chaotic confines of the prison infirmary. He was 42 years old, and his autopsy would reveal that he had been stabbed 6 times in the chest and neck and had defensive wounds on his hands. He also had a broken nose and a fractured skull. The killer was identified as Robert Wilson, an inmate serving a life sentence for aggravated murder. He was a member of the Winter Hill Gang, a notorious Irish-American crime syndicate operating in the Boston area. Wilson took out DeSalvo for undercutting the prison drug market by selling amphetamines at a lower price. For decades after his death, DeSalvo's confession was met with skepticism and controversy. Some people believed he was the Boston Strangler, as the murder stopped after his arrest. Others thought he was a liar, only seeking attention, and that the Boston Strangler was actually more than one killer, because the victims varied in age, appearance, and social status. But a recent discovery put an end to the speculation and confirmed DeSalvo's guilt. July 11, 2013. Boston law enforcement officials announced that they had matched DeSalvo's DNA to the crime scene of Mary Sullivan, one of the Boston Strangler's victims. They had exhumed DeSalvo's body and tested his DNA against the seminal fluid found on Sullivan's body. The results were conclusive. DeSalvo was the source of the DNA. Roger Kibbe.
An autopsy finds convicted serial killer Roger Kibbe was strangled to death in his Mule Creek State Prison cell.
For 10 long years, Roger Reese Kibbe hunted down and murdered at least 7 women who crossed his path on the Sacramento freeways. He was known to be the notorious I-5 Strangler. 1987, Kibbe's reign of terror came to an abrupt end when he picked the wrong target, Deborah Ann Guffey, a sex worker who fought for her life and screamed for help, attracting the attention of a police officer. Thanks to Guffey's testimony, Kibbe was convicted of assault and battery and jailed for 8 months, during which the police built a murder case against him. Now, authorities believe that he was the infamous I-5 Strangler, a serial killer who was terrorizing the Sacramento and Stockton areas along Interstate 5. In 1991, Kibbe would face trial for the murder of Darcy Frackenpole, a woman he had kidnapped from a rest stop on I-5 and strangled with her own bra. The prosecution had 2 crucial pieces of evidence: a strand of Kibbe's hair on Frackenpole's body and a piece of fabric from his car that matched the cuts on her clothes. Kibbe was eventually found guilty and sentenced to 25 years to life, but that didn't stop prosecutors from trying to establish a connection between him and the remaining murders. 2009, Kibbe struck a deal with authorities to avoid the death penalty. He pled guilty to the murder of 6 other women and received 6 more life sentences. February 28, 2021, in Mule Creek State Prison, Kibbe met his end in the same manner he used to end the lives of his victims, by strangulation. This man was found dead in his cell at around 12:40 a.m. by an officer who was conducting a routine check. Kibbe's killer was his cellmate, Jason Budrow, an inmate who was serving a life sentence for strangling a 48-year-old woman. Budrow was a self-proclaimed Satanist who had a history of violent behavior. Now, Jason later admitted that he had killed Kibbe to avenge his victims. He was then charged with first-degree murder with special circumstances for murdering Kibbe and received a life sentence. Interestingly enough, Budrow is now facing charges for attacking another inmate just last year. Donald Leroy Evans. July 5, 1957, born in Michigan. Evans left a trail of blood across the country. This man was a sexual predator, kidnapper, and murderer. Mr. Donald Evans here claimed to have killed more than 70 people in 22 states. 1986, his first conviction was when he sexually assaulted a woman in Galveston, Texas, where he would receive 15 years in prison, but for some reason only served 5. He was then paroled in 1991, and he went back to Galveston, where he worked as a motel clerk. But this wouldn't last long. The parole officials didn't like the idea of a sex offender working in a motel, and they had him fired. He would then find another job on a fishing boat, but this man just couldn't stay away from his dark impulses. He molested and killed a girl, who he snatched from a park in Gulfport, Mississippi. He tortured her for a whole day before strangling her with a rope and dumping her body in the woods. August 5, 1991, Evans was caught and confessed to the crime. He was then sent to a federal prison in Colorado, where he faced kidnapping charges. But this wouldn't be the end of his story. August 16, 1993, he was also tried in Mississippi, where he was found guilty of sexual battery and murder. The jury showed him no mercy as they sentenced him to death. Now, while on death row, he made a shocking revelation. He said he had killed dozens of other people, mostly at rest stops and public parks. He gave details matching some unsolved cases in Florida. He would even plead guilty to one of them, the 1985 strangulation of Ira Jean Smith, and he got a life sentence for that too. 1993, Evans escaped from the Harrison County Jail by using a makeshift knife to overpower a guard. He was found a day later hiding in a shed at a lumber yard near the jail. However, he never got to see his execution date. 1999. In a shocking twist of fate, the self-described white supremacist, still under heavy suspicion for 12 murders, met his end in a whirlwind of violence inside the prison shower. His assailant, none other than Jimmy Mack, an African-American death row inmate. Evans and Mack were both being taken to the showers when Mack fatally stabbed Evans with a prison-made shiv. Now, no one knows why exactly he stabbed Evans, but some believe that Mack was insulted by Evans's public bragging about being a white supremacist. Correction officials had no comment on whether the murder was racially motivated, but the district attorney had this to say: "We don't mourn him, we simply close his file." Jose Antonio Rodriguez Vega. Between August 1987 and April 1988, Jose Vega, known as El Mataviejas, or the Old Lady Killer, sexually assaulted and killed at least 16 elderly women. December 3, 1957. Vega was born in Santander, Spain. While growing up, he would have disturbing sexual thoughts about women, including his own mother. And when he turned 18, Vega became so violent that his mom threw him out of the family home after he kicked his wheelchair-bound father down the stairs. From that point forward, he developed a deep resentment for his mom and vowed to take revenge on her by assaulting a lot of women. 1978. After a string of sexual assaults, he was caught and given 27 years in prison. But surprisingly, he charmed his way out of his sentence by convincing his victims to forgive him, which fortunately for him, they dropped his sentence to 8 years. 1986. He was released from prison, only to find that his wife had left him. He couldn't cope with that rejection, so he would marry again, this time to a mentally disabled woman. He would abuse and humiliate her behind closed doors while pretending to be a loving husband in front of everybody else. Rodriguez Vega was a pathological liar and fooled everyone. This man was seen by people as a good person, a hard-working man, and a model citizen. But his dark secret was that he was a serial killer. Vega's first victim was Victoria Rodriguez, a 61-year-old prostitute he had slept with regularly. They got to talking after sex when he suddenly had a desire to put his hand over her nose and mouth until she suffocated to death, which he ended up doing. All of his other victims, all abused and killed the same way, were planned and selected beforehand. All of them were lone women who had hired him to do construction work in their homes, or who he convinced to let him in with a ruse. In many cases, their bodies weren't discovered until several days after they died. And you wouldn't believe it, but despite the concerns of some families, and the victims being found bruised and with no underwear, the deaths were somehow attributed to natural causes and not investigated. Even after a morgue employee told police and the press that 3 of the deceased women had genital injuries. April 19, 1988, Vega murdered Julia Paz Fernandez in Muriadas, and jurisdiction subsequently fell to the Spanish Civil Guard rather than the police. Midway into the investigation, the Civil Guard learned that Paz had just hired a worker to reinforce her entry door, none other than Rodriguez Vega, and that he had been in prison for sexual offenses. May 19, 1988, Vega was arrested after police located him in an apartment he was sharing with a displaced woman. He nonchalantly confessed to his gruesome murders. During his interrogation, he talked about his deep hatred for his mom, saying that he considered her to be the driving force behind his killings of elderly women. In November 1991, Vega went to trial. Despite having already given a full confession, Vega denied everything during his trial and said that the women had died of natural causes. But as you can imagine, nobody believed him. He was given 440 years in prison, which in real time translates to no more than 20. This is due to a maximum term principle in the Spanish judicial system that dictates that even if a person is sentenced to hundreds or thousands of years in prison, they'll only serve a fraction of that time. This principle is based on the idea that prison sentences should be meant for rehabilitation and not a punitive purpose. By 2008, Vega was supposed to be released, and many believe that he would most probably continue killing, but he never lived to see that date. October 24, 2002. His 2 fellow inmates, Miguel de Valle and Jose Manuel Obellero, ambushed him during a routine stroll in the prison yard because they suspect that he was a snitch. This guy was stabbed 113 times, while the guards just stood back and watched. The following day, Vega was laid to rest, with only 2 gravediggers present to witness his hurried funeral, a stark testament to his lonely end. Leroy Martin. The late 1960s. A small town in South Carolina was terrorized by a serial killer preying on women and girls. He was known as the Gaffney Strangler, claiming the lives of 4 victims in less than a year.
It was a very devastating time. It scared everyone in Gaffney.
April 25, 1937, Leroy Martin was born in Gaffney, South Carolina. Now, he grew up in a poor and abusive family, which led him to developing this violent and antisocial personality. He would drop out of school at an early age and work at a textile mill in Cherokee County. He married and had 3 children, but he was also a habitual cheater and a heavy drinker. May 20th, 1967, his killing spree began when he murdered 32-year-old Annie Lucille Dedmond. She was a married mother of 2, and Martin mercilessly strangled and sexually abused her in her own home. Later that day, her husband Roger Dedmond came home from work and found her body. He obviously became the prime suspect and was arrested and convicted of his wife's murder. 9 months later, the strangler struck again. He abducted 20-year-old Nancy Carol Paris, who was walking her dog at night. Her body was found later on a riverbank beneath a bridge. She also had been strangled and abused. A few days later, he would strike again with the same MO by killing Christine Reinhardt, who was on her way to school. Her body was found buried under a brush pile, with one foot sticking out. February 8, 1968, the strangler made his first phone call to Bill Gibbons, the editor of the Gaffney Ledger. He gave Gibbons directions to locate 2 bodies, and he insisted that he was the real killer of Annie Dedmond and not her husband. Now, Gibbons reported that information to the police, who found the bodies of Paris and Reinhardt. 4 days later, the strangler called Gibbons again, warning that there would be more killings. February 13, 1968, Martin kidnapped Opal Diane Buxton, who was walking to the school bus stop with her sister. Now, her sister witnessed the abduction and gave a description of the vehicle and the driver to the authorities. The police would launch a massive manhunt, but they were too late. Buxton's body was found in a wooded area several days later. She had been strangled and stabbed to death. After learning of Buxton's abduction, 2 local residents, Henry Transow and Lester Skinner, decided to patrol the area, looking for that car matching the description given by the police. Within hours of the abduction, they spotted a car parked in a secluded spot in the woods, and a man standing beside it. When they drove by, this man quickly got inside and drove away. They wrote down that license plate number and reported it to the police. Later, they found out that the car belonged to Leroy Martin. February 16, 1968, the police would track Martin down and arrest him. After a search of his car and house, they found evidence linking him to those murders. Martin confessed to the killings and showed the police where he had dumped the bodies. However, because he wasn't given proper legal representation, the authorities didn't seek the death penalty. Martin was eventually convicted of 4 counts of first-degree murder. He received 4 life sentences, but he wouldn't even get to spend a quarter of that sentence. May 31, 1972, Rumsey, who was serving time for robbery and assault, stabbed Martin many times in the back and chest with a makeshift knife while Martin was working as a janitor in the prison. The tragedy deepened as Rumsey, grappling with his own demons, chose to end his life in his cell soon after. Daniel Camargo Barbosa. February 1986. The police finally arrested Daniel Barbosa, one of the most prolific serial killers in history, and is believed to have sexually assaulted and murdered at least 72 girls in Colombia and Ecuador. When asked why he committed these heinous acts, he smiled and simply said, "I rape virgin girls because they cry." January 22, 1930, Barbosa grew up in a wealthy family in Anolema, a small town in the Colombian Andes. When Barbosa was just 2 years old, his mother passed away and his father quickly remarried. Despite these early challenges, Daniel showed great intelligence and excelled in school, showing an IQ of 116. However, when he tried to reach out to his father, regardless of the subject, he would cut him short and tell Barbosa that he was useless and a lost cause. Eventually, Daniel would lose any interest in interacting with his father, and he perfected his newfound ability to lie and manipulate people, using it as a means to get out of having conversations with them. Now, the family later faced financial hardships, and Daniel resorted to petty theft to make ends meet. 1962, Daniel was living with Alcida, a woman he had 2 children with, but not legally married to. At the same time, he thought he had found his true love in Esperanza, a woman he wanted to make his wife. But his dreams were shattered when he discovered that she wasn't a virgin, and worse, that she had cheated on him with another man. That was the turning point that unleashed Camargo's dark obsessions. He made a twisted pact with Esperanza. He would forgive her and stay with her if she helped him find other virgin girls to violate. And so they became a sinister duo of crime. Esperanza played the role of the bait, enticing girls to their apartment with false promises and then dishing out sleeping pills to knock them out. Daniel would then take advantage of their helpless state and assault them. Now, they got away with this horrific scheme 5 times, sparing the lives of all their victims. But their luck would run out when the 5th girl they abused managed to report the crime to authorities, and both Daniel and Esperanza were arrested and sent to prison. April 10, 1964. Daniel faced justice for his sexual assaults when the judge sentenced him to only 3 years in prison, a verdict that Barbosa welcomed with gratitude, vowing to reform and redeem himself. But little did they know that his crimes were far from over. 1973, Barbosa was deported from Brazil for being an illegal immigrant. He settled in Barranquilla, Colombia, where he worked as a street vendor selling TV monitors, containing his dark impulses for a while. Now, one day as he was passing by a school, he spotted a girl and abducted her. He would take her to a secluded place where he violated her and then killed her because he didn't want her to report him to the police, as his previous victim had done. This would be the first murder, but definitely not his last. Barbosa went on this killing spree spanning across 2 countries, claiming the lives of as many as 80 girls, according to reports. February 26, 1986, Daniel's reign of terror came to an end when he was caught by 2 policemen in Quito, Ecuador, just minutes after he had killed a girl named Elizabeth. The policemen were suspicious of his behavior and searched him. They eventually found a bag with bloody clothes and the clitoris of his latest victim. This man was arrested and later identified by Maria Alexandra Velez, a survivor who had escaped his clutches. Barbosa here then confessed to killing 72 girls in Ecuador alone. He would show the authorities where he had buried his victims. He told them how he had committed these heinous crimes, all without a trace of remorse or guilt. Barbosa was given 16 years in prison, the max penalty in Ecuador at the time. But he never got the chance to walk out of that door and terrorize any more women. Because by November 13, 1994, this guy was taken out by inmate Giovanni Noguera, who would stab him 8 times and cut off one of his ears as a trophy. Noguera was the nephew of one of Barbosa's victims and had sworn to avenge her death. Barbosa died on the spot, mirroring the violence that defined his turbulent existence. Leopold Dion. 1963. A predator and serial killer terrorized Quebec, Canada. This man was Leopold Dion, the monster of Pont Rouge, who preyed on boys, whom he deceived with his charm and his camera. But before he became a murderer, he was already a violent criminal. His first known attack was on a woman from Pont Rouge, whom he and his brother brutally assaulted and stabbed on a railway track. They thought they had killed her, but she miraculously survived, scarred for life. Dion's thirst for blood wasn't quenched by this near-fatal act. He soon embarked on a killing spree that would claim 4 innocent boys as his victims. His first was Guy Luckennuck, a clarinetist who had come to Quebec City for music lessons. Dion approached him with a friendly smile and an old camera, pretending to be a photographer. He would snap pictures of the boy and suggest that they would go somewhere else for more. He drove him to a secluded spot in the countryside, where he strangled and buried him under a sand dune. May 5, 1963, Dion encountered 2 more boys, Alan Carrier and Michel Morel. He used the same ruse to lure him into his car, then took him to an abandoned cottage in Saint Raymond des Portneuf. There he would tie up Alan, telling him it was a game of prisoner. He would lead Michel outside, where he ordered him to strip naked. He then strangled him with a wire and returned to the cottage to smother Alan. May 26, 1963, he met his last victim, Pierre Marquise. He also fell for Dion's fake photographer act and agreed to go with him to the same spot where Guy Luckennuck was buried. Dion asked him to pose nude, and he complied. But when Dion tried to molest him, he resisted. Unfortunately, Dion overpowered him and strangled him to death. Dion's reign of terror would come to an end the next day when he was arrested by the police. They had received a tip from another boy who had managed to escape from Dion's clutches. He gave him a detailed description of Dion and his car, which led him to his capture. Now, Dion initially denied his crimes, but after a month of interrogation, he confessed to everything and even showed the police where he had hidden the bodies. April 10, 1964, Dion was sentenced to death by hanging, but his sentence was later reduced to life imprisonment after his lawyer appealed to the Supreme Court of Canada. This man spent the next 8 years in prison until he met his own violent end. November 17, 1972, Norman Champagne, a man who also went by the name Lawrence de Arabi, brutally stabbed him to death. Champagne and Dion were both imprisoned at the notoriously violent Archambault Institution, where numerous other prisoners and guards have been murdered over the years. And even though Norman Champagne was eventually charged with killing Dion, he was ultimately acquitted by reason of insanity. Charles Schmid. The 1960s. Tucson, Arizona was a place where teenagers could hang out, have fun, and enjoy the sun.
Everybody had slept with their doors unlocked and the windows open and so forth. But things were starting to change.
Lurking among these teenagers was a sinister figure, luring unsuspected girls into his deadly trap. This man was known as Charles Howard Schmid Jr., and he was a cold-blooded killer who claimed the lives of 3 girls. July 8, 1942. Born to a single mother who didn't want him, he would be adopted by the next day by Charles and Catherine Schmid, a wealthy couple who ran a nursing home in Tucson, Arizona. But his new life was far from happy. He had a difficult relationship with his father, whom his mother later divorced. He also tried to find his biological mom, but when he did find her, she rejected him and told him to stay away. Now, Schmid was a poor student, but a gifted athlete. He led his high school to the state gymnastics championship. But he once said, "The thing that kept me fascinated with gymnastics was that it frightened me. If I slipped or fell, that could be the very last time." But this fear wouldn't enthrall him enough, because he quit that team in his senior year. Shortly thereafter, he was suspended for stealing tools from his school shop class, and he walked out of the school for good. 1958, at 16, Schmid was feeling lost without a clear path for his future. Now, he somehow decided to move into a guest house on his mom's property, where she provided him with $300 a month for living expenses. He shared the guest house with his friend, Paul Graff, and they quickly became friends with John Saunders and Richie Bruns. They would spend their nights cruising on the Speedway Boulevard, looking for girls and booze. But Schmid wasn't a handsome man. This guy was so short he would stuff his boots with rags and cans to make himself taller. He drew a mole on his face and dyed his hair black to make him look more attractive and more like his idol, Elvis Presley. He believed he could attract women with looks and charisma. However, this was all a facade, behind which he tried to hide his true sinister desires, knowing what it feels like to take someone's life. May 31st, 1964. He got his wish. He convinced his girlfriend, Mary French, and his friend, John Saunders, to join him in his murderous scheme. He would lure Aline Rowe, a young girl who had a crush on him, to go on a double date with him. He told her she would be with Saunders while he would be with French. But it was all a lie. They all knew what he really wanted. They drove her to the desert where he and Saunders attacked her and smashed her head with a rock. French stayed in the car listening to the radio, pretending not to hear her screams. They buried her body in the sand and drove away. A year later, he killed again. This time, his victims were his own girlfriend, Gretchen Fritz, and her sister, Wendy. He couldn't keep this secret to himself, so he bragged to his friend Richie Bruns, and even showed him where the bodies were. Bruns was terrified. He thought his own girlfriend could be next, so he ran away to Ohio, where he told his parents everything. He became the star witness for the police, who finally arrested and charged Schmid for the murders of 3 girls. 1966. Schmid was found guilty of murder. For Rowe, he got 50 years to life in prison. For the Fritz sisters' double murder, he got the death penalty. When the Arizona Supreme Court abolished the death penalty, Schmid's sentence was commuted to life. Schmid changed his name to Paul David Ashley and turned to writing music and essays to keep himself busy. He also used to walk around the prison as if he were superior to other prisoners. It didn't take long before 2 fellow prisoners decided they had enough of that. March 20th, 1975. This man was stabbed 47 times, an act of revenge that echoed throughout the facility. For 10 agonizing days, he teetered on the brink of life and death before ultimately succumbing to his injuries. Jeffrey Dahmer. May 27, 1991. This naked and bleeding man would stumble onto the street looking for help. 2 women saw him and called the police. They tried to comfort him, but what they didn't know was that the worst was yet to come. The woman called the police, but when they arrived at the scene, a handsome blonde man walked up to him and calmly explained that everything was fine. He said that this man was his lover and they had a fight, so he would take him back to his place and sort things out. Who could have really known that this was the notorious serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer? And that poor man was about to become his latest victim.
His killing field was Milwaukee, and he got away with murder for more than a decade. But how could any of this happen?
May 21st, 1960. Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer, born to a middle-class family in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, seemed like he was a normal child, but really had a dark, twisted fascination with death. This guy would collect dead animals and dissect them, sometimes keeping their bones and organs as trophies. At 8 years old, his family moved to Bath Township, a quiet suburb of Akron, Ohio. There, Dahmer felt lonely and isolated. He had a few friends and was bullied at school. He also struggled with his own sexuality, finally realizing that he was gay. So he would turn to alcohol to cope with his problems, and soon become a heavy drinker, even bringing booze to school and hiding it in his jacket. But alcohol wasn't enough to satisfy his urges. He wanted more, and so weeks after he graduated high school, Dahmer committed his first murder.
I don't know how to put it, possess them permanently.
And that's why you killed them.
Right.
It was but one of 17 murders that Dahmer would commit between 1978 and 1991 by luring men back to his home, often offering them money to pose nude for him before killing them. Then this guy would snap photos of the lifeless bodies and use chemicals to dissolve those bodies and keep their skulls as grisly trophies. And as if that wasn't twisted enough for you, Dahmer soon developed a taste for human flesh, and also experimented with lobotomizing his victims. He would drug them, then drill holes into their skulls, and then inject some hydrochloric acid into their brains, hoping to create a zombie-like slave that would obey his every command. But fortunately, Dahmer's horrific spree would soon come to an end, thanks to a brave escape. July 22, 1991, Dahmer went after 32-year-old Tracy Edwards. Like he did with many of his victims, Dahmer offered Edwards money to pose nude for photos in his apartment. But to the shock of Edwards, Dahmer handcuffed him and told him that he was going to eat his heart. Now terrified, Edwards attempted to appease Dahmer, telling him that he was his friend and that he would watch TV with him. While Dahmer was distracted, Edwards punched him in the face and ran out the door. He flagged down a police car and led officers to Dahmer's apartment. There, the policemen discovered photos of dismembered corpses, which were clearly taken in the same exact apartment that they're now standing in. What they found in this apartment defies all human comprehension. This guy scattered his dismembered bodies all around his apartment, including his kitchen and his own bedroom, and even some were used as decorations. So Dahmer was arrested immediately, and it didn't take long for him to admit to all 17 of his murders. Now at his trial, he pled guilty to 15 of the charges and received 15 life sentences plus 70 years. This man showed no remorse or emotion, only a blank stare. He would spend his days in prison haunted by his own demons. He thought about taking his own life but never really got the chance. November 28, 1994. He would meet his end at the hands of another killer, Christopher Scarver, a convicted murderer who brutally attacked him with a metal bar in the prison bathroom. With a shattering blow, he crushed his skull, leaving him to a fate of inevitable death. Scarver later said that Dahmer didn't resist or scream during the assault. He seemed to welcome death. Dahmer's mother said that he had given up on life long ago. She said, "If he had a choice, he would have let this happen to him. I always asked if he was safe, and he would say, 'It doesn't matter, Mom. I don't care if something happens to me.'